Get on the ground. Everyone down. 4 armed terrorists storm into street. Michael's Cathedral. Automatic weapons drawn. Tactical gear. Complete control of the sacred space. 23 people in evening prayer service hit the floor in terror, but the old priest at the altar doesn't move. You too, Father. On your knees. Father Thomas Murphy slowly turns from the crucifix. Gray hair, gentle eyes, weathered hands that have blessed thousands of souls. I'm afraid I can't do that, he says quietly. What happens next will redefine everything you think you know about men of God. You're about to witness something sacred and deadly. The terrorist leader's rifle swings toward Father Thomas. I said get down, old man. I heard you, Father Thomas replies calmly. But I can't abandon my flock. His hand moves to the heavy brass crucifix on the altar, 12 inches of solid metal. In trained hands, it becomes something else entirely. 35 seconds. That's all it takes to reveal 15 years of hidden truth. The crucifix flies with perfect precision, striking the first terrorist in the temple. He drops like divine judgment, his weapon clattering across the marble floor. Father Thomas moves with fluid grace that belongs in a combat zone, not a sanctuary. Rolling behind the altar as automatic rifle fire erupts, bullets splintering ancient wood where he'd stood moments before. Second terrorist advances down the center aisle. Father Thomas emerges with a heavy iron candlestick, wielding it like a medieval mace. One's wing, clean strike to the nerve cluster below the jaw. Unconscious before he hits the ground, third terrorist by the church doors realizes he's not fighting a priest anymore. He's facing someone else entirely. Raises his weapon, but Father Thomas has already vaulted over a pew with impossible agility for a man of God. The prayer kneeler becomes a weapon, applied to the gunman's wrist with surgical precision, forcing him to drop his rifle. Then a sleeper hold that sends him into darkness in seconds. Fourth terrorist, the leader, backs toward the exit, firing wildly, but Father Thomas anticipated this. A throne hymnal strikes the man's gun hand. Weapon flies away. Father Thomas closes distance and applies a joint lock that immobilizes without permanent damage. 4 armed terrorists, 35 seconds. 0 shots on target. 0 civilian casualties. Father Thomas stands among the unconscious men, breathing normally, like he'd just finished evening mass instead of neutralizing 4 deadly threats. Complete silence. Then shocked whispers from the congregation hiding behind pews. Father Thomas, how did he? What just happened? Father Thomas walks calmly to the altar phone. 911, 4 armed individuals at St. Michael's Cathedral on 5th Street. Suspects are secured and unconscious. Send paramedics. 2 have head injuries. He hangs up and looks at his flock. Is anyone hurt? As if he just prevented a minor disruption instead of a terrorist attack. But this story didn't start 35 seconds ago. It started 18 hours earlier. That morning, Father Thomas had arrived at St. Michael's Cathedral at 6 a.m., like he had every day for 15 years. Unlocked the heavy wooden doors, lit the candles, and prepared for morning prayer. Father Thomas was the ghost of St. Michael's. That's what the parishioners called him. He appeared when you needed spiritual guidance, disappeared when you didn't, and never spoke more than necessary to provide comfort. For 15 years, nobody knew his story. He was just the quiet priest who kept the cathedral running with gentle efficiency. But Father Thomas Murphy carried secrets that would shock the faithful community that thought they knew him. The morning congregation had filed in for prayer. Elderly widows seeking comfort, young mothers with restless children, working men stopping before their shifts. Father Thomas ministered to them all with the same calm dedication. What they didn't see was how Father Thomas's eyes constantly assessed every person who entered his church, how he positioned himself for tactical advantage while conducting services, how he moved with unconscious precision that had nothing to do with liturgical training. Because Father Thomas Murphy had spent 12 years as a Special Forces chaplain with the 82nd Airborne Division, he'd provided spiritual guidance to soldiers in combat zones where death was a daily companion and faith was tested by fire. He'd blessed men before missions they wouldn't survive, comforted the wounded in field hospitals under enemy fire, conducted services in forward operating bases where mortar rounds interrupted prayers. But 12 years ago, Father Thomas had traded his military chaplain cross for civilian collar, his combat boots for dress shoes, his unit for a congregation that would never know what spiritual battles he'd fought in places where faith and warfare intersected. He'd come to St. Michaels because he wanted to minister to souls in peace instead of preparing them for war. He wanted to offer comfort without the sound of gunfire in the background. For 15 years, it had worked. Father Thomas had found purpose in quiet service, healing in routine ministry, peace in the sacred space where violence was supposed to be impossible. Until tonight. Back to the present. Police sirens growing louder, the 4 terrorists still unconscious on the cathedral floor. Church administrator Margaret O'Brien emerges from behind the organ where she'd taken cover during the attack. "Father Thomas," she says, voice shaking, "what in God's name was that?" Father Thomas straightens his clerical collar and begins picking up scattered prayer books. "Defended the congregation." "Defended? You just took down 4 armed terrorists like you were." "Like you were?" "Like I was what, Margaret?" She stares at him, seeing her gentle priest in an entirely different light. "Like you were a soldier." The congregation slowly stands, looking at their spiritual shepherd with new eyes. Mrs. Henderson, who's attended services for 30 years, young couple with twin babies, construction worker who stops by every Tuesday. Detective Sarah Williams arrives with backup, crime scene tape, paramedics for the unconscious terrorists. She surveys the scene. 4 automatic weapons secured behind the altar, 4 suspects professionally restrained, 0 civilian casualties despite a coordinated attack on a house of worship. "Father," she says, "I need to understand what happened here." Father Thomas hands her the weapons, properly cleared and safe. 4 individuals entered during evening service with apparent intent to harm my congregation. I neutralized the immediate threat using available resources and minimum necessary force. Williams studies him. "That's military language, Father." "What's your background?" For 15 years, Father Thomas has avoided this moment. For 15 years, he's successfully hidden from the skills that once defined his spiritual service. But there's no hiding now. "Special Forces chaplain," he says simply. 82nd Airborne, 12 years. Combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The words hang in the sacred air like a confession nobody expected. Margaret stares at him. "You're telling me that for 15 years I've had a Special Forces chaplain running our cathedral?" "Former Special Forces chaplain," Father Thomas corrects. "I'm a priest now. This is who I am." "But why didn't you tell us?" Father Thomas looks around his church where he's spent 15 years learning to heal souls instead of preparing soldiers for battle. His answer reveals the cost of the skills that just saved 23 innocent lives. "Because everything I learned in the military about ministry was connected to war. I came here to learn how to serve God in peace." But tonight's events have forced Father Thomas to confront a truth he's been avoiding for 15 years. The skills that made him effective in combat chaplaincy are the same skills that protected his flock from evil. Maybe there's a way to honor both callings, the warrior chaplain he was and the peaceful priest he's become. Young Father Kevin approaches with his twin daughters. "Father Thomas, how did you know how to do that?" Father Thomas kneels to the children's level. "Sometimes God gives us abilities we hope we'll never need to use. But when his people are in danger, we use whatever gifts we have to protect them." Detective Williams completes her report. The 4 terrorists are identified as members of a radical cell that had been targeting religious institutions. Their plan was to create maximum casualties during a peaceful worship service. What they hadn't planned for was encountering someone with Father Thomas's unique combination of spiritual calling and tactical training. As the criminals are loaded into ambulances, Father Thomas resumes his position at the altar. The congregation, still processing what they witnessed, gradually returns to their seats. Evening prayer continues. But everything has changed. Mrs. Henderson approaches him after the service. "Father, I've been coming here for 30 years. I never knew." "There was no need to know," Father Thomas replies gently, "until tonight." "So who are you really?" Father Thomas straightens the altar cloth and extinguishes the candles. "Someone who learned that serving God and protecting his people sometimes require the same skills, expressed differently." 3 weeks later, Father Thomas makes a decision that changes his ministry. He begins working with military chaplains transitioning to civilian ministry, teaching them how to serve congregations that have never experienced combat, while honoring the unique perspective that military service brings to spiritual leadership. He keeps his position at St. Michael's, but he no longer feels the need to completely separate his military chaplain experience from his civilian ministry. Word spreads through the military chaplain community. St. Michael's Cathedral becomes an unofficial gathering place for veteran chaplains who understand what Father Thomas represents, not because he's a warrior, but because he's a shepherd who never forgot how to protect his flock. The Ghost of Street. Michael's Cathedral revealed himself to be something far more complex. A man of peace who retained the ability to wage righteous war when evil threatened the innocent, blessing marriages, comforting the grieving, baptizing children, ready to act when darkness entered his sacred space. The local news covers the story. Priest stops terrorist attack, but Father Thomas declines interviews. He's not interested in fame. He's interested in the next service, the next soul that needs guidance, the next opportunity to serve God in the way he's called to serve, because that's who Father Thomas Murphy chose to become. Not a warrior, not a hero, just a priest who happens to possess skills that saved lives when evil came to his door. So I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose gentle nature hid extraordinary capabilities? Someone whose peaceful calling didn't eliminate their ability to fight for what's right? Share their story in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful protection comes from those who've chosen peace but never forgotten how to wage war for righteousness. Thank you for watching. If this moved you, subscribe and help us honor the quiet guardians who serve in ways both spiritual and practical. These are the people who remind us that faith and courage aren't opposites. Sometimes they serve communion, sometimes they serve justice, but they always serve with dedication that transcends understanding. And remember, the next time you see a priest whose calm presence seems unusual, whose confidence appears unshakable, whose hands seem to have known more than blessing and prayer, you might be in the presence of someone whose faith was forged in fire and tempered by service in places where heaven and hell were separated by very thin lines, but who chose to minister where peace was possible, one prayer at a time.